Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to the Andi Mack review. Last week, we were treated to the best episode of the series thus far. This time around, we've got a dress code protest. Otherwise known as, the show earned a ton of goodwill last week, so now they feel they can tone things down a bit. So, with all that said, let's dive into episode 11, Were We Ever? We start things off with the introduction of a new school principal. He's not happy with the school's recent drop in the rankings, so his plan is to be a stickler for the dress code. Except there are some major problems with his arguments and the way he goes about doing things, which I'll dig into later. So, Bex gets involved and tells the trio of friends that they should protest the dress code by wearing prison outfits, and if that's not engaging in a metaphorical hyperbole, then nothing is. But, of course, Principal What's-His-Face has a problem with that protest. But instead of addressing it like an adult, which he only does much later, he decides that actually listening to his students is way harder than literally making up new rules as he goes, which he can't do, despite his dubious claim that he can. There's no executive orders in education, that would be stupid. So the whole debacle plays out exactly like you'd expect, with Bex contributing by handing out the prison outfits. Not sure there would ever be this many people ready and willing to protest this dress code, but okay, fine. Let's just assume that a huge section of this middle school are warriors for justice. Even the ones that are clearly just joining in to feel included because they did not bother to change. This leads to a conversation between Andi and Jonah. Jonah wants Andi to partake in the Frisbee team pictures, but doesn't want to participate in the school-wide revolt. Notice though that he perfectly understands why Andi is doing this, even correctly referring to the prison garb as a metaphor. Remember that for a little later, and by a little later I mean right now. So, all of this commotion is juxtaposed with picture day for no real reason, but Andi doesn't want to change out of her prison uniform for her jersey because her cause matters to her. She directly asks Jonah if he remembers why she's wearing a prison uniform, and he freezes like the proverbial deer in headlights. Except, despite the fact that he was barely paying attention to her explanation, he understood enough to respond, "It's like a metaphor." Are you seriously trying to tell me that he was so wrapped up in picture day that he couldn't recall information he figured out just a few hours prior? He didn't even try, and it makes no sense as a catalyst for the final few minutes. And in those final few minutes, Jonah tries talking things out with Andi, and Andi says enough is enough. To be clear, Andi's actions here do make some sense. Her friendship with Jonah to this point has been a little one-sided if you recall everything they've been through prior to this. He even went so far as to allow Amber to trick her, insult her to her face, and then take her side despite all of that. However, the inciting incident was sloppily handled, and the easy fix would have been either make Jonah disagree with the protest, or make him so oblivious, which he's proven to be at times, that he misses the point of it entirely. Going halfway doesn't work here. But it does work for Andi and Bex, who finally get Principal whoever he is to discuss amending parts of the dress code. And that's Were We Ever, an episode with a couple sizable problem areas. Let's start with the education side of things, since that is my profession. Firstly, an incoming principal would not and should not hone in on dress codes in an attempt to facilitate test score growth as a first order of business. It's a lazy TV trope used solely because it's easy to make an episode out of, especially since in almost all shows like these, there would be at least one main character adversely affected by targeting his or her fashion trends. All of this only exists because there's a new, stricter guy in charge now, yet another overused TV trope. And what's more, by just focusing on the surface level of this issue, it ignores the really interesting areas of the debate in favor of just one side clearly bullying the other into submission, only to eventually lose in a typical sitcom fashion. For example, girls are way more likely to be targeted and subsequently penalized for dress code violations. Why wasn't that a bigger plot point? Early on, Principal, who is he again, calls Andi's leggings distracting, and that's an episode all its own. Also, dress codes are oftentimes written with a certain standard of appearance in mind. That standard can at times be less realistic and more wishful thinking, depending on the district. That means that clothes they deem inappropriate oftentimes fall under the category of only clothes certain kids can afford, which is even more troublesome because students of lower socioeconomic backgrounds need more school support, not less, especially that early on. These are the conversations we should be having in place of, oh my gosh, what face should I make, guys? And by the way, even though there is no permanent record per se, there are important school records that will affect your ability to get accepted to top tier high schools or colleges down the line. Middle school records don't typically follow you into high school, but if you're looking to get into anything selective, do not just brazenly overlook this stuff. Now, let's move on to the protest itself. While it does make sense that Buffy, being a fierce woman, and Andi, being heavily characterized by artistic expression, would want to start a protest against a dress code, it does feel undercut a bit by Bex's involvement here. We already know that Bex is a rebel, so having her so involved in all of this makes it mean way less to the trio of friends, and as a result, takes away a lot of development that could have come from it. This doesn't excuse Jonah's actions in this episode, or the way this episode framed him altogether, but it does make Andi's ultimatum lose a bit of punching power. She claims that this protest means a lot to her. She claims to be one of its leaders, but at no point was I convinced that it really did, or that she really was. It felt more similar to Andi's connection to Frisbee, something she likes but doesn't necessarily love. That's purely a perspective point, and your mileage might vary on that, but for me, something just felt missing there. And now, we turn our attention to the last few minutes. I did like what Andi had to say and why she felt that she had to say it, and we already know based on previews that this will lead to likely the final breakup of Jonah and Amber. The episode title is a good question to ask because, as I mentioned, in spite of Jonah's always positive attitude, there were a few times where he unwittingly caused Andi problems because sometimes he just doesn't know any better. And so far, their so-called friendship has been a fair amount of Andi giving and Jonah taking without much of the reverse. If anything, he's been a better friend to Cyrus than Andi so far in the series. But that said, the emotional angle that She Said took felt way more like a final straw sort of deal than this episode ever could. It's okay and it sort of works, but only if you overlook a few aspects in getting there. All in all, surprising a grand total of no one, this episode is nowhere near as good as the last one. It has a clear focus, no subplot, and a good enough ending, which at least makes it better than She's Turning Into You. But beyond that, there's way too many holes, tropes, and inexplicable nonsense here to overlook. Not a great episode, but certainly not the worst one either. It's passable, but it gets so much wrong about the education system and misses so many chances to delve deeper into an interesting debate. But let's not get it twisted here, Mac fans, because being critical of this show does not change the fact that I like it. If you think this is overly critical, then clearly you've never heard my thoughts on this dickweed. But I digress. Andi Mack needs to do better than this because it can, which means when it doesn't, it's choosing to, and then nobody wins. Next week promises to be more drama-filled, which is usually where this show shines, so a better episode is hopefully incoming. But until then, thanks for watching.